Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Imagine watching one of the biggest television shows in America and suddenly realizing that one of the characters you had grown attached to was never coming back. No warning. No proper goodbye. Sometimes, not even a chance to say farewell. That was the reality behind MASH, the legendary series that premiered in 1972 and turned a story about a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War into something much bigger. It was funny, heartbreaking, political, and surprisingly honest about the human cost of war. But while audiences watched the characters struggle together on screen, the cast itself was constantly changing behind the scenes. Some actors wanted bigger opportunities. Some believed their characters were being pushed into the background. Others were exhausted by the demands of the production. And in at least one case, the actor's departure became one of the most shocking moments in sitcom history. So why did these actors really leave MASH? And did some of them eventually regret walking away? Let's start with the departure that changed the show forever. McLean Stevenson, Henry Blake. For longtime MASH fans, few moments are more unforgettable than the ending of Season 3. The episode, Abyssinia, Henry, appears to be giving Colonel Henry Blake the perfect send-off. After years at the 4077th, Henry finally receives his discharge and prepares to return home. There are hugs. There are smiles. There are emotional goodbyes. Everything suggests that this is simply the end of one character's journey. Then the tone changes completely. During surgery, Radar enters the room carrying devastating news. Henry Blake's plane has been shot down over the Sea of Japan. There are no survivors. The scene ends without a dramatic soundtrack or the usual comedic escape. The characters simply stand there, stunned, trying to process what they have just heard. It was an extraordinary decision for a sitcom, especially at a time when television usually gave departing characters a much softer exit. But the shocking ending wasn't simply a creative decision made out of nowhere. It happened because McLean Stevenson had decided he was leaving. Stevenson had been one of the central members of the original MASH cast. As Henry Blake, he played a commanding officer who was often overwhelmed by the chaos around him but still cared deeply about the people under his command. Fans loved him. But Stevenson increasingly felt that the show was becoming more and more centered around Alda's Hawkeye Pierce. As Alda became increasingly involved in writing and directing, Hawkeye gained greater emotional and narrative importance. Stevenson, meanwhile, felt that his own role was becoming less significant. And Stevenson had ambitions of his own. He didn't simply want to remain part of an ensemble. He wanted to become the leading man. He wanted the opportunity to carry a show himself. So, at the end of Season 3, Stevenson told the producers that he would not be returning. Normally, that might have meant Henry Blake being transferred somewhere else or simply written out. But MASH wasn't interested in pretending that war was harmless. The creators saw Stevenson's departure as an opportunity to make a much bigger point. In war, people don't always get to go home. And that's exactly what happened. The response was enormous. Viewers were shocked and angry. CBS reportedly received thousands of letters from people reacting to Henry's death. Some praised the show's honesty. Others felt the writers had gone too far. The irony was that Stevenson had left because he wanted to become an even bigger television star. At first, it seemed like the right decision. He signed a major deal with NBC and received his own sitcom, The McLean Stevenson Show. But it didn't last. The series was cancelled after one season. Another project, Hello, Larry, performed poorly as well and became the subject of criticism and jokes. Eventually, Stevenson admitted that leaving MASH had been a mistake. He later described the decision as having taken himself out of the game. And that may be the cruelest irony of all. Stevenson wanted to escape being remembered as the second or third most important person on a show. Instead, the role he left behind became the performance most closely associated with his career. Henry Blake was gone. But the impact of his departure remained. And then another major star decided to leave. Wayne Rogers, Trapper John. If McLean Stevenson's departure was dramatic, Wayne Rogers' exit was almost the exact opposite. There was no devastating farewell episode. No emotional goodbye. No final celebration. Trapper John simply disappeared. Wayne Rogers had played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's closest partner during the early years of MASH. The two characters had an effortless chemistry. They joked together, broke rules together, and acted like two old friends trying to survive an impossible situation. For many viewers, Hawkeye and Trapper were the heart of the original MASH formula. But behind the scenes, Rogers had begun to feel that the balance was changing. When he joined the show, he understood it to be a genuine ensemble. But as the series developed, Hawkeye became increasingly central to the storytelling. Alda's character wasn't simply another doctor anymore. He was becoming the show's moral center. And Rogers began to believe that Trapper was being pushed into the background. The problem wasn't necessarily that Rogers disliked Alda. In fact, the two reportedly remained friendly. The problem was the character. Trapper had started as a genuine co-lead. Now he increasingly felt like Hawkeye's sidekick. Rogers later explained that Trapper no longer had enough meaningful material to justify staying. So Rogers chose not to renew his agreement after season 3. And this is where his departure became particularly unusual. Unlike many television actors, Rogers apparently wasn't trapped by a conventional signed contract. His arrangement with the production had been based on a handshake deal. That meant the producers had very little legal leverage when he decided to walk away. They reportedly threatened legal action, but Rogers had not formally violated a traditional contract. He was simply leaving. The timing caught the production off guard. The writers had to scramble to explain Trapper's absence at the beginning of season 4. And the audience wasn't exactly thrilled. After already losing Henry Blake, fans were now losing another major member of the original group. But this time, there wasn't even a proper farewell. Trapper John was simply gone. In his place came a new character, BJ Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell. BJ wasn't designed to be a simple copy of Trapper. The tone changed. The wild buddy comedy energy of the early seasons gradually gave way to something more reflective and emotionally complicated. And strangely enough, MASH continued to evolve. In some ways, the departure of Trapper helped push the series toward the more serious, character-driven direction it would eventually become famous for. Rogers, meanwhile, built an entirely different career after MASH. He continued acting for a while, but eventually became deeply involved in finance and investing. His life moved far beyond Hollywood, even though he never completely abandoned the entertainment world. And despite leaving under such unusual circumstances, there doesn't appear to have been permanent hostility between Rogers and his former castmates. Alan Alda later spoke warmly about him, remembering him as intelligent, funny, and someone he genuinely missed after he left. But there was still another major departure waiting. And this one wasn't driven primarily by ambition. It was about exhaustion, family, and the emotional price of staying on MASH year after year. Because next, we're talking about the man behind Radar O'Reilly. Gary Burghoff. And his story may be the most personal of them all. Gary Burghoff had already watched two of his closest MASH colleagues disappear. First Henry Blake. Then Trapper John. But when Gary finally decided to leave, the reasons were much more personal. Gary Burghoff, Radar O'Reilly. For millions of viewers, Radar was the heart of MASH. Gary Burghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly as innocent, nervous, loyal, and strangely gifted at knowing what was happening before anyone else. He could hear helicopters approaching before the others. He could sense when something was wrong. And beneath all the comedy was a character who represented innocence in the middle of war. But playing Radar came with a price. By the later seasons, the demanding production schedule was taking its toll on Burghoff. The pressure of working on such a successful show, combined with his own perfectionism and personal struggles, became increasingly difficult to handle. There was also another problem. Family. Burghoff had a young daughter, and the long hours required to make MASH meant spending enormous amounts of time away from home. The more successful the show became, the more difficult it was for him to maintain the kind of personal life he wanted. Eventually, the demands of MASH became too much. He wanted more flexibility. He wanted more time with his family. And he wanted some control over his own life. There were also contractual discussions involving pay, scheduling, and fewer appearances. The producers understood how important Radar was and tried to accommodate him, including giving him additional time away from the series. But it wasn't enough. By season 8, Burghoff had made his decision. He was leaving. And unlike Wayne Rogers, Burghoff received a real farewell. The result was Goodbye, Radar, a two-part story that became one of the most emotional departures in MASH history. Radar returns from leave and discovers that the 4077th has changed. For years, he had been the young man who could fix everything. But this time, he realizes that he can't stay forever. His mother needs him. The family farm needs him. And perhaps most importantly, Radar himself has finally grown up. The final image says more than dialogue ever could. Radar walks away while his teddy bear is left behind on Hawkeye's bunk. It is almost like the show is physically leaving his childhood behind. For viewers, saying goodbye to Radar wasn't simply losing another cast member. It felt like losing the innocence of the show itself. After MASH, Burghoff largely stepped away from Hollywood. He made a few appearances and even tried a short-lived spin-off called Walter, which attempted to continue Radar's story. But it didn't last. Eventually, Burghoff found other interests, including painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing. He even held patents, including one related to fishing equipment. In the end, his decision to leave wasn't really about chasing another massive television role. It was about rebuilding his life. As the source material puts it, Burghoff's reasons came down to family and burnout. And perhaps that's why his departure feels so different. He wasn't trying to become the next superstar. He was simply trying to become himself again. But MASH wasn't finished losing major characters. Because the next departure came from one of the show's most memorable villains. Larry Linville, Frank Burns. It is difficult to imagine early MASH without Major Frank Burns. He was rigid, petty, self-important, and somehow convinced that everyone else was the problem. Larry Linville played Frank so perfectly that audiences practically loved to hate him. Frank's obsession with rules made him the perfect opponent for Hawkeye and Trapper. But there was a problem. As MASH evolved, the rest of the characters became more complicated. Hawkeye became more emotionally developed. Margaret Houlihan became much more layered. The series became increasingly interested in morality, relationships, trauma, and the human cost of war. Frank Burns, however, remained largely the same. He was still the punchline. Still the antagonist. Still the man everyone could laugh at. And Linville eventually felt that there wasn't much more he could do with the character. By the end of season 5, he decided not to renew his contract. He wasn't fired. He wasn't forced out. He simply believed he had taken Frank Burns as far as he could. That decision changed the show. Frank's departure created space for a very different kind of character to enter the 4077th. And that character was Major Charles Emerson Winchester III. David Ogden Stiers, Charles Winchester. David Ogden Stiers entered MASH during season 6, taking over the role that Frank Burns had left behind. But Winchester wasn't another Frank. He was cultured, brilliant, arrogant, sophisticated, and much more complicated. At first, Charles Winchester seemed like another obstacle for Hawkeye and BJ. But over time, viewers began to see something underneath the arrogance. He wasn't heartless. He was simply guarded. The series gradually revealed his humanity, and Stiers played that transformation with remarkable restraint. Unlike several of the actors we've already discussed, Stiers didn't leave in the middle of the series. He stayed all the way to the finale. And his final moments were fitting. Rather than leaving because of a conflict, Winchester's story received a sense of closure. His final scenes, including teaching Chinese prisoners of war to play Mozart, showed just how far the character had evolved. When MASH finally ended, Stiers didn't continue the story through after MASH. He felt Winchester's journey was complete. And that was the important distinction. Sometimes an actor leaves because they are unhappy. Sometimes they leave because they are exhausted. And sometimes they leave because the character has simply reached the end of the road. Loretta Swit, Margaret Houlihan. But there is one major actor who stayed through all 11 seasons. Loretta Swit. When MASH began, Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan was very different from the woman audiences would eventually come to know. Initially, Margaret was often treated as a joke. She was strict. She followed military rules. And much of her early characterization revolved around her relationships with the men around her. But Swit refused to let Margaret remain trapped in that role. Season by season, she pushed the character toward something deeper. Margaret became intelligent, independent, vulnerable, and respected. She became much more than Hot Lips. She became one of the show's most fully developed characters. Swit's performance helped prove that MASH wasn't just a story about male surgeons joking their way through war. Margaret had her own battles, her own moral questions, and her own emotional journey. While several major male cast members left over the years, Swit remained. She appeared in all 11 seasons and became one of the essential faces of the series. And that's what makes the story of MASH's cast so fascinating. The actors who left weren't all running from the same thing. McLean Stevenson wanted to become a bigger star. Wayne Rogers believed Trapper was no longer being given enough to do. Gary Burghoff needed to step away from the pressure and spend more time with his family. Larry Linville believed Frank Burns had reached his creative limit. David Ogden Stiers stayed until the story was finished. And Loretta Swit remained from the beginning to the end, helping transform Margaret Houlihan into one of television's most memorable characters. The departures changed MASH. But they didn't destroy it. If anything, every major exit forced the series to reinvent itself. Henry Blake's death reminded viewers that this wasn't an ordinary sitcom. Trapper's departure pushed Hawkeye into a different kind of relationship with BJ. Radar's goodbye showed that even the most innocent character couldn't remain untouched by time. Frank Burns' exit allowed the writers to move beyond a simple cartoon villain. And Winchester's journey demonstrated how even an arrogant character could become deeply human. That's the strange legacy of MASH. The cast kept changing. The characters kept leaving. But the show somehow kept finding new ways to tell the same fundamental story. War changes people. Sometimes they grow. Sometimes they break. Sometimes they leave. And sometimes, like Loretta Swit's Margaret Houlihan, they stay long enough to see the entire journey. After 11 seasons, MASH finally came to an end. But the departures remain some of the most memorable moments in the show's history. Because behind every exit was a real actor making a real decision. And in some cases, those decisions changed the careers of the people who made them forever. So, which MASH departure surprised you the most? Was it Henry Blake? Trapper John? Radar? Frank Burns? Or was there another character you think deserved to be included? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look behind the scenes of one of television's greatest shows, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about classic television and the actors who made it unforgettable.